Hi there. Today I want to talk about the difference between idealistic versus pragmatic animal advocates. And the reason I want to talk about this today is the recent release of the book written by Tobias Leenaert, How to Create a Vegan World, a Pragmatic Approach. So this book is basically a wake-up call for many animal advocates to start being more effective by being more pragmatic. So the book deals with more effective or rational approaches for the animal advocacy movement. Now let's first give some definitions. What do I mean with rational? It basically means accurateness in beliefs, so this is epistemic rationality, effectiveness in means, that's instrumental rationality, and consistency in ends or values, moral values. That's the axiological rationality. So, for example, animal advocates are defined as the people who advocate for a vegan world, where animal rights violations are abolished, so the abolition of animal rights violations, and where exploitation of animals is eliminated. Now this end, the vegan world, that is a consistent end, so it's rational to fight for this end. That's axiologically rational. But now we have to look for good strategies to reach that end, and therefore we need instrumental rationality. We need effectiveness. And here you can see a divide within the animal advocacy movement. So basically we can divide the animal advocacy movement in two camps, but there are intermediate positions as well. So on the one hand you have the realists, or what Tobias Leenaert calls the pragmatists. And I call them realists because they use methods and strategies that work in the real world, where people, such as meat eaters, have cognitive biases and do not always make rational decisions. So on the one hand you have the realists, they use strategies that work in the real world. On the other hand you have the idealists, and that means they use methods and strategies that only work in an ideal world. An ideal world, well, people always behave rationally and will be easily persuaded by rational arguments or by indignant judgments such as meat is murder, dairy is rape, meat eaters are moral monsters, factory farming is an animal holocaust. So these are judgments or statements given by idealists, animal advocates. And in an ideal world, when I'm a meat eater and someone says to me meat is murder and I realize meat is murder, I immediately stop eating meat. That would the situation be in an ideal world. But in a real world, when meat eaters are confronted with a statement that meat is murder, they do not immediately stop eating meat. So we have to use more effective strategies to convince those meat eaters. If the goal is to achieve a vegan world as fast as possible, a rational strategy uses effective means that not only work in an ideal world, but also work in the real world. So realist strategies are more effective, but they are cognitively more demanding, as they require rational, critical thinking, changing one's own mind, and they require self-control. Whereas the idealist strategies, they are less effective, but they are cognitively less demanding, because they are based on spontaneous intuitions and gut feelings that can be very strong, but sometimes irrational. So this difference between the realists and idealists comes from a psychological duality, what is generally known as System 1 and System 2 thinking. So this notion of System 1 and System 2 was put forward by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, who did psychological research. He wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow, about this research. Now System 1, that's a way of thinking that generates automatic, spontaneous, intuitive, emotional, very quick judgments based on mental rules of thumb or shortcuts, mental shortcuts called heuristics. So often those automatic, spontaneous intuitions, they are very reliable, but sometimes in unfamiliar situations, such as in the situation where we have to look for effective strategies to create a vegan world. That's a very unfamiliar situation. In those situations, intuitions or gut feelings become they can become systematically unreliable, and they can generate cognitive biases. So as an example of a mental shortcut or a cognitive bias, there's this puzzle. A bet and a ball costs $1.10 together. The bet costs $1 more than the ball. How much costs the ball? Now, if you have to give a quick automatic response using your system 1 thinking, your response is most likely wrong. So most people answer 10 cents, and the ball costs 10 cents, but the true answer is 5 cents. Now, what about system 2? On the other hand, this is a slow or more effortful and logical way of thinking. So this corresponds with what Tobias Leenaert in his book calls slow opinion, critical thinking. With effortful critical thinking, system 2 can correct erroneous judgments generated by system 1. And so animal advocates, they need system 2 thinking to look for solid reasons and scientific evidence to choose the most effective strategies that work in the real world. So this requires a lot of critical thinking, system 2 thinking. So here we can see a kind of a paradox. Effective rational animal advocates should be realists, apply strategies that work in the real world. And in the real world, meat eaters often behave and think irrationally. Now it seems a bit paradoxical, but it means that rational realists, animal advocates, should take irrationalities of meat eaters into account. So the choices made by meat eaters often violate their own values or their own ends. And meat consumption is accompanied with many rationalizations or fake arguments and cognitive biases. And when confronted with animal rights arguments, there is clear evidence that meat eaters feel a cognitive dissonance. So this is evidence that meat eaters have irrationalities. And if you do not take those irrationalities into account, your strategy might be ineffective or even counterproductive. So an idealistic strategy is often more irrational because it does not properly take into account irrationalities of meat eaters. Idealists act as if meat eaters are rational and therefore should be easily persuadable by arguments or judgments. When meat eaters are confronted with judgments from vegans or become aware of the morally superior choices of vegans, those meat eaters, they often feel a cognitive dissonance. Their reactions can become counterproductive, which is called a backfire effect. So meat eaters can persist in their meat consumption. They start to derogate vegans and they start denigrating animals even more. So this is a backfire effect. Now this idealistic animal advocates, they often criticize realistic or pragmatic animal advocates for adopting immoral strategies, because the system 1 judgments of the idealists are emotionally very strong, but not compatible with the thought through system 2 thinking of the realists. So the strategies chosen by the realists are often counterintuitive and hence appear immoral in the eyes of the idealists who use intuitive moral thinking. So one example of a strong system 1 effect that underlies a lot of idealist judgments is what I call mental purity. So idealists believe that it is wrong to make our hands dirty. This language reveals a moral disgust. As physical disgust can be a very strong emotion, moral disgust can be strong as well. So I will give some examples where this difference between idealists and realists is based on this system 1 effect of mental purity. Most of those examples are also discussed in the book, How to Create a Vegan World. But I will add some more examples to make it the case even stronger. So first about purity in consumption behavior. If you look at idealistic vegans, they are often dogmatic about sticking to the rule. They are very strict about their vegan diets. For example, they do not want to eat a vegan meal served at a non-vegan restaurant. Or they want to avoid all animal products and exclude the small animal ingredients, such as some E numbers. in their products. Even in situations where there is no expected benefit for the animals and where their strictness can have dissuading effects on meat eaters, so can have counterproductive effects on meat eaters. Even then, they want to stick to those vegan rules. Sticking to the strict rules can push off meat eaters. So realistic vegans, on the other hand, they are more relaxed and flexible about the concept of veganism. So if there are reasons or evidence that a more flexible way of veganism is more effective to persuade meat eaters, realistic vegan animal advocates are more flexible, can more easily adopt those more flexible concepts of veganism. So the dogmatism of idealists is based on system 1 thinking. So it's a judgment that we should stick to a rule, and this judgment is made quickly and easily. Whereas having to adapt to the situation or the context, having to think about what meat eaters, how meat eaters perceive strict vegans, having to think about this situation and the context requires more cognitive effort of system 2 thinking. So it's more effortful to having to keep in mind what your audience, the meat-eating audience, thinks. So realists or pragmatists, they have to critically think about the consequences of their choices. Sometimes our choices appear to be good, such as strictly avoiding animal products, but they can be counterproductive, such as dissuading meat eaters. Sometimes our choices appear to be important, such as avoiding small amounts of animal products. It appears to be important, whereas they have no positive or negative effect on animals. For the animals, that's the case that when someone cooks a meal for you, and in this meal there is a product. This product contains some small animal products, E numbers, for example. Your host cooks for you. Your host is a meat eater. Suppose you refuse that meal, even if it's almost vegan. Only small amounts of animal products are in the meal. If you refuse it, you have to be effective. You have to think about how your host perceives veganism, and thinking about this is cognitively effortful. So it's system 2 thinking. It's often easier to stick to the rule and avoid the meal. For system 1, it's the easiest solution. So you can compare this with an often irrational fear of, for example, toxic pesticide residues on food. So people often want to avoid tiny traces of applied pesticides and want to pay a lot of money for organic food products that do not contain those pesticides, even if the health risks of the synthetic pesticide residues are negligible compared to the much higher amounts of natural pesticides produced by the plants themselves, or the organic pesticides that can sometimes be more toxic than synthetic pesticides. So in organic farming, organic pesticides are allowed, and sometimes synthetic pesticides are less risky, less toxic than some organic pesticides. But most of all, 99.99% of all the pesticides in an apple are produced by the apple itself. They are in the apple. That doesn't mean that the apple is unhealthy. We do know that there are in the apple a lot looking at these pesticides, how carcinogenous they are. It's as carcinogenous as average applied pesticides, synthetic pesticides. So there are carcinogenous pesticides in the apple. There are a lot of them. But also the apple produces a lot of healthy protective chemicals. A lot of them. So in general, we know that eating apples is very healthy. Eating fruits and vegetables is very healthy, even if they contain pesticides, and 99.99% of the pesticides are produced by the apples, and only 0.01% are applied on the apples by the farmer. So, taking into account that the apple produces a lot of chemicals themselves, some carcinogenous, but most of them protective. If you look at studies, there's no evidence of a health risk of these pesticide residues. Yeah, we do not even know how many people will die from the pesticide residues. You cannot see this clearly in the statistics. The organic so sometimes organic pesticides are more toxic and than synthetic pesticide residues, the pesticide risks of the apple are buried under the much higher amounts of healthy protective chemicals produced by the apple. Now we can look at the willingness to pay to avoid risks. Yeah? Some people are willing to pay much more money to avoid the risks of the tiny traces of some synthetic pesticide residues, compared to other risks such as traffic accidents or chronic diseases from unbalanced diets. Yeah? Even if those latter risks are much higher. Yeah? So, for example, riding a bike for 20 kilometers gives you a mortality risk of about 1 in a million. How much money are you willing to pay to eliminate this risk of an accident? Let's say you're willing to pay 50 euros or so to avoid this risk, the risk of mortality of 1 in a million. But we know that organic products are much more expensive. So if you want to buy all your products organic, you have to pay a few hundred euros a year. And it's not clear if you pay, let's say 500 euros, that you eliminate a risk of 1 in a million. Yeah? Even if you pay 10 times more than your willingness to pay for the accidents with riding a bike. So this reveals an inconsistency or an irrationality. Yeah? And the same can be true in the case of the small ingredients, small animal ingredients in products. The effects of consuming those ingredients on the food markets and on the livestock industry is probably negligible. But the effect to dissuade meat eaters when they see the strict vegans, that's a real effect, dangerous effect, because dissuading meat eaters result in them continue eating animal products. Another example of purity is the fact that idealistic animal advocates are often reluctant towards eating cultured or clean meat. That is the same substance as animal meat, but does not involve animal rights violations. So in a few years, clean meat will be on the market. And these purists, these idealistic animal advocates, they have developed a feeling of moral disgust towards meat. They associate meat with animal rights violations, and then they develop a moral disgust. And that feeling also extends to something that resembles meat, in this case clean meat. So you can compare this with the experiments where you put a disinfected insect in someone else's coffee. Now, after removing the insect, that person is not willing to continue drinking from that coffee. Even if that person is disgusted, even if there are no traces of the insect left in the coffee. Yeah. So once a feeling of disgust is triggered, it cannot easily be erased. It requires a lot of cognitive effort or system 2 thinking to overcome that feeling of disgust. Related to this is a purity in identity. So idealistic vegans think in black or white, which is characteristic of system 1 thinking. Either you are vegan or you are not. So it's binary, you're vegan or you're not. There's no soft veganism or thing like that. For idealistic vegans, veganism is part of someone's identity. It is not merely a collection of food choices. Yeah? It is something that you are or you are not. Yeah? And if you are, you have to obey the rule very strictly and avoid all animal products as far as feasible. Now, seeing nuances requires more effortful system 2 thinking. Idealistic vegans are often afraid of gray areas. Therefore, they prefer to think in terms of all or nothing. So for them, gray areas are dangerous because they are not pure. They are not completely white. They are contaminated with some blackness. Yeah? And so this idea of contamination reflects a moral disgust. Yeah? So once you eat tiny traces of animal products, you are contaminated by some blackness, some badness, some animal rights violations. And like with the insect, even if it's a very small effect, the insect in the coffee, even if it is a disinfected insect and the insect is removed, even then it is difficult to overcome this feeling of impurity or this feeling of disgust. Yeah. So some vegans, they do not want to eat a vegan burger that was cooked on a plate where there was previously a piece of meat. So they do not want to have this contact with meat. Another important thing about strategies is the purity in messages. So idealistic vegans often criticize realistic vegans for sending out wrong, immoral messages. So instead of the clear, straightforward message, go vegan, the realists often ask for reducing meat, eat more plant-based, join Meatless Mondays. Yeah. And then the critique is, okay, Meatless Mondays, it's like rape-free Mondays, which means you condone eating meat or rape on the other days. But that's actually not a valid argument. It doesn't follow that you're allowed to eat meat on the other days. So a go vegan message might be too demanding or ambitious for most meat eaters. So for them, working with smaller steps can be more feasible. Smaller steps like eating vegan 1 day a week or eating vegan 1 week for 1 week, that might be more feasible. But our system 1 often objects to those more nuanced but perhaps more effective messages, because system 1 wants to stick to the clear message, a direct reference to the final goal, the vegan world. If you want a vegan world, okay, then the message is only go vegan. Another example is a purity in focus. For idealistic animal advocates, we have to focus on the only important argument to go vegan, and that is the animal rights argument. So introducing other arguments such as the health and or environmental benefits of vegan diets is considered as a distraction or sometimes considered as being harmful. So realistic animal advocates are open to those other messages, the health message of veganism, for example, and they want to apply them if they are proven effective. Yeah. So the focus of idealists on one argument or one objective is an example of what I call a single objective bias, as if talking about other benefits for veganism introduces impurities in the real message of animal rights. So single objective bias can also be seen in another situation of, for example, idealistic feminists who promote family planning, use of contraceptives, to improve women's right to bodily autonomy. So unwanted pregnancies are a serious violation of the right to bodily autonomy, and family planning intends to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Okay, now if some environmentalists also start to promote family planning in order to avoid unintended births and hence avoid future environmental impacts of newborn people, these environmentalists are often criticized by the feminists who argue that women's rights should be the only or the primary objective, that the environmental objective is a fake objective. And finally, there's an example of purity in collaborations. So that's also discussed in the book of Tobias Leenaert. So in choosing with whom to collaborate, idealistic animal advocates often make ineffective choices that only work in an ideal world. So idealists are more exclusive and want to collaborate only with people who are fully like-minded. Realists, on the other hand, are more inclusive and can have many collaborations. So in his book, Tobias Leenaert gives the example of idealists criticizing collaborations with businesses that sell both vegan and non-vegan foods, or collaborations with TV chefs who cook both vegan and non-vegan recipes. The idealists do not want to celebrate or support the choice of large meat companies that invest in animal-free products. So a lot of big meat companies, Tyson for example, start investing in vegan animal-free products, or clean meat for example. And that's something that realists should, that we should celebrate, but idealists do not want to celebrate this choice. So those idealists are again rather concerned about purity than about effectiveness. They don't want to make their hands dirty with some collaborations they deem unacceptable. And another striking example of this purity in collaboration within the animal advocacy movement is the concern about animal activists who have racist judgments. Okay, so people like Brigitte Bardot are advocating for animal rights, but they also make racist statements, for example, against Muslims. So idealistic anti-racist activists do not want to have anything to do with those racist activists. They want to keep their movement clean from racism. However, rejecting those activists is not always effective. So first of all, those rejected activists are not going to change their mind about racism when they are rejected by the animal advocacy movement. So their level of racism will not decrease when they are not allowed to join the vegan community. On the contrary, they will associate themselves more with other racists and start to distrust anti-racists even more. So on the other hand, when these activists with racist opinion, when they are not expelled from the community, those activists can more easily come into contact with anti-racist activists. So both activists have something in common, their fight for animal rights. And now this is interesting because due to this commonality, the anti-racist activists are perceived as sympathetic by the activists with racist opinions. Yeah? They have something in common, so the racist activists think more sympathetically about those anti-racists. So people are more easily, there's psychological evidence that people are more easily persuaded by other persons who appear sympathetic. So the anti-racist activists are more able to persuade the activists with racist opinions. And now when the racist activists are welcome in the movement, chances are higher that eventually they will be persuaded by anti-racist opinions, compared to the situation where they are not welcome in the movement. So for the anti-racist activists, welcoming those racist activists requires more effortful system 2 thinking, because they can no longer simply ignore those activists, they cannot simply stay away from them. They are basically forced to communicate with them, to communicate with them in a more effective way. Yeah? So they have to face those activists with racist opinions. Now, believing that contact with racist activists makes your own hands dirty is an irrational belief because it is not effective in fighting racism. So it would be more effective to welcome those other activists. Okay, these are enough examples about the purity of idealistic animal advocates. I highly recommend you reading the book How to Create a Vegan World, a Pragmatic Approach by Tobias Leenaert. See you next time.